In 1944, as the European conflict approached its conclusion, Japanese leaders were beginning to accept the grim reality of impending defeat. With Germany in disarray and Allied forces advancing on various fronts, Japan found itself under increasing pressure in the Pacific. Faced with this dire situation, some members of Japan's political elite started to consider the possibility of negotiating peace, aiming for terms that could maintain national honor and avoid an unconditional surrender. This narrative delves into one intriguing yet lesser-known diplomatic endeavor from that time, the Baga Peace Feeler. This covert initiative, led by Swedish envoy Vidar Bagi in Tokyo, received backing from key Japanese officials and sought to establish dialogue with the Allies via neutral Sweden. Although it ultimately proved unsuccessful, it highlights the complexities and quiet aspirations that surrounded late-war diplomacy. Within the final stages of the war, Sweden engaged in efforts to broker peace for Japan that would align with its military and political leadership's desires. By the fall of 1944, it was clear to some influential Japanese that defeat was unavoidable, prompting a range of channels to gauge the possibility of a peace agreement. One such avenue included the involvement of Swedish minister to Tokyo, Vidar Bagi, in what came to be known as the Bagi Maneuver, often referred to as the Bagi Peace Feeler. This initiative stood out because it had the support of two successive Japanese foreign ministers. While none of these efforts ultimately succeeded, reflecting on this moment of failed diplomacy reveals both the potential and constraints of neutral mediation. Baga's actions are noted in Japan's diplomatic history, yet they receive only brief mention in the landmark study of Swedish foreign policy during World War II by Wilhelm Carlgren, who led the Swedish Foreign Ministry archives from 1965 to 1987. His extensive work, published in 1973, contains but a fleeting footnote about Bagi amidst nearly 600 pages of content. The next year, diplomat Erich von Sydow reached out to him. As we know, von Sydow had served under Bagi at the Swedish legation in Tokyo during the war. He had been approached by British historian Lewis Allen, who wanted comments on a chapter about the Bagi Peace Feeler. Von Sydow then forwarded this request to Carlgren for his insights. In his reply, Carlgren proposed that Baga's involvement might have roots in Sweden's role as a peace broker during the continuation war between Finland and the Soviet Union. This experience could have led the Japanese to believe that Foreign Minister Günther and his team had the necessary discretion and skill for such sensitive matters. Perhaps von Sydow's letter prompted Carlgren to examine Bagi's actions more closely than he had when writing his history in 1973. By 1985, he had included details of Bagi's efforts in a study of Swedish mediation during World War II. What follows is the most comprehensive historical account of the Bagi Maneuver, based on both published and unpublished materials from Sweden and Japan. Vidar Bagi, while a senior diplomat, did not belong to the upper ranks of the Swedish Foreign Service. A colleague described him as a demanding leader with a meticulous nature, very aware of diplomatic decorum and his personal dignity. Another colleague, who worked under Bagi in Tokyo from 1940 to 1945, noted his irritation at having only one embassy secretary, while the Swiss minister had more staff. This colleague labeled Bagi as a difficult person, and a close relative described him as a loner. He certainly had a reputation for being somewhat meddlesome. Bagi assumed his role as Swedish minister to Japan on January 1, 1937, and remained there until mid-April 1945, aside from brief travels to other countries. When he departed Japan for Sweden, he held the title of Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Tokyo. In standard references regarding Japanese foreign policy, he is often portrayed as a Japanophile. According to Shigemitsu Mamoru, one of Japan's wartime foreign ministers, who was familiar with the Swedish diplomat Bagi, he had lived in Tokyo for a long time, understood Japan well, and held a strong reputation for sincerity. His good standing seems to have been why peace-minded Japanese approached him for assistance in efforts to end the war. Additionally, as the representative of neutral Sweden, he was one of the few who could act as a mediator between Japan and its adversaries. The initial peace initiative began in mid-September 1944, when Suzuki Bunshiro, a prominent journalist and managing director of Asahi Shimbun, one of Japan's leading newspapers, reached out to Baggy. They were already friends from previous encounters. Mushakoji Kintomo, a former Japanese minister to Sweden, had first introduced them back in 1937. According to Baggy's statement during the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, Suzuki mentioned that Prince Konoe and his associates were behind a plan he wanted Baggy to relay to the Swedish government, requesting that Sweden gauge interest in London regarding peace. Baggy informed the Foreign Ministry in Stockholm with a telegram. "I have learned from a reliable source that influential civilian groups are increasingly discussing the peace issue. They expect a swift German defeat and doubt Japan's ability to hold out. Therefore, they believe it's crucial to secure peace quickly before further destruction occurs. They anticipate British war fatigue and generally think negotiating a peaceful settlement with England would be less challenging than with the United States. To achieve this, they would be willing to return all territories seized from Britain during the war and recognize former British interests and investments in East Asia. They also understand that other occupied areas must likely be returned, and they might even need to forfeit Manchukuo. They want to explore these possibilities in London and think this could be done through Swedish mediation, provided there's no British publicity. If they can establish understanding in London, they are ready for preliminary talks via Sweden. My source is one of the most recognized statesmen in the country, and it's clear that this is a serious inquiry. If you find it suitable, feel free to update the English minister regarding the second part of the message. The other sections are meant solely for your eyes. Please share your thoughts with me at your earliest convenience." On the telegram kept in the Swedish National Archives, there are two quick notes: "The Yellow Cupboard" and "Mallet told by Gunther 19th of September." The Yellow Cupboard, located in the office of the head of the political section in the Foreign Ministry, held documents so sensitive that their existence was kept entirely secret. Gunther refers to Christian Gunther, the Swedish foreign minister, who reached out to the British minister in Stockholm, Sir Victor Mallet, to relay Bagge's message. Disregarding Bagge's advice to only inform the British minister about the second point, Gunther shared the entire content. Mallet quickly reported back to the British Foreign Office, stating that the Tokyo minister believed this attempt should be seen as serious. The Foreign Office concurred. On September 24th, Lord Halifax, the British minister in the United States, was directed by the Foreign Office to inform U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull. Hull agreed with a British suggestion to inform the Swedish Foreign Ministry that the Allies were not inclined to respond to indirect Japanese overtures. Allegedly, behind this peace offer was Prince Konoe Fumimaro, a close relative of the emperor and a former prime minister we encountered earlier. Considering the possibility of a neutral mediator for peace, Konoe supposedly asked Suzuki to reach out to Bagge. Suzuki thought Sweden should take independent action as a neutral country. However, researcher Kobayashi Tatsuo claims that Konoe was not truly informed about these developments. Suzuki only used his name to catch Bagge's attention and lend credibility to the proposal, but he eventually updated Konoe on the matter. A week later, Bagge informed Stockholm that even the foreign minister is said to be contemplating peace options. This telegram was encoded, reserved for sensitive situations. On September 30th, Victor Mallet met with Eric Boheman, the Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs, and received an update regarding Bagge's telegram from September 27th. Mallet conveyed to Boheman that Washington and London were not inclined to respond to indirect Japanese overtures, but he noted that the Swedish minister could inform them that passing on the Japanese message would be futile. Later that same day, Boheman sent a telegram to Bagge stating, "Based on previous experiences, we understand that the English side does not engage with unofficial communications, so we felt it inappropriate to relay the message." As a result, Bagge remained unaware of how the foreign ministry in Stockholm was managing his information. This telegram was the first response from Stockholm that reached Bagge, and its sensitive content was evident as it was stored in the same secure location as Bagge's earlier telegram from September 19th. Boheman described the telegram as of considerable interest and encouraged Bagg to keep the lines of communication open. This was likely a source of reassurance for Baggy, while also disappointing as he realized that the Swedish government opted not to share part of his message with the British, as he had suggested. Further telegrams from Bagge over the coming months revealed that he had engaged with both the Japanese foreign minister and the deputy foreign minister. This was expected, given his position as the dean of the diplomatic corps in Tokyo, but also showcased his strong connections with the Japanese political leadership, owing to Sweden's role as their protecting power. In a cable dated December 12, 1944, Bagge informed Stockholm of the Japanese government's genuine gratitude for Sweden's assistance. On that same day, he clarified who was behind the approach mentioned in his September 19th telegram, stating, "The individual referenced in my code 365 Quarto First Point stepped down as Prime Minister 2 months prior to the war." Bagge expressed his willingness to stay in touch with this person, but cautioned that it was currently extremely sensitive and risky for them. On a telegram preserved in the Swedish National Archives, someone has written in pencil, "This is Prince Konoe, who resigned October 16, 1941. Other handwritten notes on the telegram indicate that Bagge's insights were deemed so crucial they reached the desk of Foreign Minister Christian Günther. The discussions Bagge had with peace-minded Japanese officials seemed to reignite efforts to pursue peace talks. In a telegram dated April 3, 1945, Bagge reiterated the ongoing peace initiatives. From his conversations in Tokyo, he conveyed that unconditional surrender was simply not an option for the Japanese. This idea carried a weight of shame, and forcing it upon them could provoke desperate actions from the Japanese populace. However, it appeared that comprehensive terms reached through diplomacy could be accepted. There was a shared understanding that victory in the war was unattainable, and concurrently, there was a belief that conquering Japan was impossible, with expectations that the Japanese would fight fiercely to the end. Changing the Japanese constitution seemed unimaginable. The emperor was above reproach. Yet, democratizing the emperor's power, similar to what had occurred in Britain with the monarchy, might be feasible. Recently, the Institute of Pacific Relations called for the dissolution of the imperial family, which sparked concern and would undoubtedly complicate any peace efforts. The day after Joseph Stalin announced the termination of the Soviet Neutrality Pact with Japan on April 5th, Erich von Post, leading the political section of the Foreign Ministry, relayed Bagge's information to Herschel Johnson, the U.S. minister in Stockholm, who quickly sent it to the State Department. The following day, Johnson reported that Wilhelm Asarson, the acting Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs, informed him that the insights shared by von Post reflected perspectives communicated to Swedish Minister Bagge in Tokyo by Japanese officials of very high rank. Johnson further noted, "It is the Foreign Office's belief, though Bagge did not specify, that these views were deliberately shared with him in the hope they would reach the attention of the United States and British governments." In February 1945, Bagge met with Sakaya Tadashi, a Japanese diplomat he had become familiar with since the late 1920s. In early 1945, Sakaya returned from Finland, where he had served as minister. During his discussions with Bagge, he found they both shared a similar outlook on Japan's urgent need to end the war. Following their February meeting, the two diplomats met over 10 times to explore peace opportunities. Sakaya later stated that Bagge had offered his help out of gratitude for the support he received while in Japan. He inquired whether Sakaya believed Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru would consider having the Swedish government gauge U.S. intentions, particularly regarding the security of the imperial family. Sakaya promptly relayed this to Shigemitsu. According to Sakaya's testimony, the foreign minister was quite pleased with Bagge's suggestion and requested Sakaya to draft a memorandum expressing a desire to meet with Bagge. This new information led Shigemitsu to add Bagge to 3 other potential channels for peace outreach, contacting the UK through Japan's minister in Madrid, through Switzerland, and through the Vatican. A meeting between Bage and Shigemitsu took place shortly before Shigemitsu stepped down as foreign minister when the Koiso government resigned on April 7th. In recounting their meeting, Shigemitsu noted that Bage was returning to Sweden and readily offered his help, stating, "I cannot bear to think of the ruin of Japan, which has such a glorious past." After careful consideration, Shigemitsu asked Bage to find out the peace terms being considered by the US and Britain, and to relay the information to him through Okamoto, Japan's minister in Stockholm, insisting that the terms must preserve Japan's honor. Shigemitsu mentioned that Bage agreed to mediate upon returning to Stockholm. Bage's affidavit to the IMTFE indicated that Shigemitsu earnestly requested him to explore the possibilities for peace. Shigemitsu also asked Bage to work with Japan's minister in Stockholm, Okamoto Suemasa, who would then report back to Tokyo. For reasons that remain unclear, Bage delayed until April 11th to report to the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Telegram in machine code from Tokyo, sent 11th of April 1945 at 1100, arrived 11th of April 1945 at 1245. I have kept in touch with my political friend, your 328, and repeatedly discussed the situation and the peace problem. He has maintained valuable connections within the government and recently updated the foreign minister on our discussions. During my farewell visit with Shigemitsu, we talked at length about this, and when asked for my honest opinion, I made it clear that I believe Japan has lost the war. I pointed out that continuing to fight would only lead to further destruction for the country and its people, without changing the inevitable outcome. The foreign minister agreed and highlighted the emperor's wish for peace, suggesting he was eager to end the war, even if it required significant sacrifices. He expressed genuine trust in me and requested my assistance in formulating a proposal for a viable solution. He specifically asked me to work with Okamoto on this matter upon my return, with the aim of fostering peace. Today, a representative of Shigemitsu visited me, stressing the urgency of the situation and confirming that Okamoto was informed about our conversation. As a result, Okamoto is expected to raise this issue with His Excellency soon. With Bage's return to Sweden approaching, he sent another telegram on April 12th to Stockholm, clearly aiming to consolidate and clarify the information he had gathered prior to his departure. He referenced his previous telegram and mentioned wanting to share some summarizing impressions. This latest telegram was less detailed about the Japanese individuals involved and referred to the opinions shared as coming from an unspecified source, which could imply the Japanese, Japan, or simply his discussion partners. This suggests that the peace overture was more widely supported than he had indicated before. Initially, Bage observed a strong desire in Japan for a negotiated peace. However, the Japanese were reluctant to take any initiative, as it might be seen as a sign of weakness. Thus, assistance was necessary to kickstart negotiations, and they would welcome proposals from the Swedish side, or at least insights into the counterparts' views. Above all, there was hope for understanding from the United Kingdom. In some circles, it was seen as regrettable that war had ever been declared against the United Kingdom, viewed as both unnecessary and ill-advised. They relied on the wariness of the English from the war, and their concerns over American advancements in the Pacific, which had placed the United Kingdom in a subordinate role. Conversely, the Japanese were ready to persevere until the very end if they weren't offered satisfactory terms. Bage indicated that his discussion with Shigemitsu reinforced his earlier conclusions from his telegram on April 3rd. He mentioned that at this point, it was believed the Americans must grasp how extraordinarily expensive a decisive victory would be, and that the United States might prefer to entertain terms that wouldn't undermine Japan's strong sense of national pride, rather than prolong the conflict. It's evident from pencil notes on the telegram preserved in the Swedish National Archives that the information shared by Bage was treated seriously at the highest echelons of the Swedish Foreign Ministry. Three key points likely caught the attention of the officials: the Japanese eagerness for a negotiated peace, the reported inviolability of the emperor, and the clear request from the Japanese foreign minister for Bage's participation in achieving a viable resolution. Baga's and Sweden's involvement was seen as a means for Japan to sidestep any initiatives that might be construed as a sign of weakness. At the same time, the officials probably noticed the change in tone in his telegrams from April 11th and 12th. Initially, he conveyed that the foreign minister expressed confidence in Bagi and invited him to assist in facilitating an acceptable resolution, collaborating with the Japanese minister in Stockholm. In his subsequent telegram, Bagi relayed that his Japanese contacts were keen for Sweden to take a more active role, which had been his main point in his earlier telegram from September 19th. This shift in focus may relate to Bagi's meeting with Sakaya that same day. While it's not precisely known when Bagi dispatched the second telegram, it likely was completed after his conversation with Sakaya, who had come to convey the perspectives of the newly appointed foreign minister, Togo Shigenori. During his meeting with Togo on April 9th, Sakaya suggested that Shigemitsu had hesitated to make a formal request for mediation and merely asked the Swedish government to gauge the U.S.'s intentions independently. Although Togo and Bagi did not meet before the envoy left for Sweden, Sakaya made it clear that the new foreign minister shared the same positive outlook on the peace situation as his predecessor. Upon hearing Togo's position, Bagi appeared quite pleased. A pencil note on the April 12th telegram in the Swedish National Archives states that Foreign Minister Shigemitsu resigned at the beginning of April, with Togo, a former ambassador to Moscow, taking over. This raised questions about whether the information Bagi had sent to Stockholm was still accurate. Shigemitsu resigned on April 7th, and 2 days later, Togo was in office, which added to Stockholm's awareness of the differing opinions within Japan's leadership. The day after, just before leaving Haneda, Bagi sent another telegram to Stockholm, reporting that the Japanese Foreign Ministry had informed him that Togo was aware of his conversation with Shigemitsu and that the change in government wouldn't alter their approach to the ongoing discussion. This message likely eased some concerns about Japan's upcoming actions. The Swedish Foreign Ministry definitely took note of Shigemitsu's shift from Bagi to Sweden, which triggered the ministry's neutrality instincts. These instincts had recently come into play after German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop proposed negotiating a separate peace with the Soviet Union. This initiative was essentially put to rest when Erich von Post, head of the political section at the Swedish Foreign Ministry, made it clear that Sweden was not interested in facilitating contact for what was viewed as an unproductive effort. A significant factor was that the United States had explicitly stated its disapproval of any German peace overtures. The Swedish government was deeply concerned about maintaining good relations with the Allied powers. The Swedish government refrained from meddling in the affairs of the great powers. For Sweden to engage, its actions had to be acceptable to all parties involved. This principle guided Sweden when it sought to mediate peace between Finland and the Soviet Union. Recent memories of King Gustav Freyth's ill-fated attempt in 1940 to act as a mediator between Hitler and King George VI lingered, leaving a mark so embarrassing that it remained undiscussed. The Swedish Foreign Ministry was particularly cautious, as it did not want to take any actions perceived as contrary to the interests of the Allied powers. The United States and the United Kingdom made it clear that they only sought an unconditional surrender from Japan, and this stance could not be overlooked. The Allied efforts against Japan had seen considerable victories, and the U.S. was gearing up for a full-scale assault on Japan following Germany's defeat. When Bagi shared his findings in telegrams on April 11th and 12th, the Foreign Ministry's response, sent to him on April 14th, was straightforward. No initiative Sweden either regarding proposals or information. Bagi likely realized that while Sweden wouldn't take action, there was no mention of a restriction on his role. However, it's unclear when he received this message. Dated April 14th, it reached him after he had already departed Japan on a special flight organized by the Gaimusho, heading to Manchukuo, from where he planned to continue on the Trans-Siberian Railway. Bagi arrived in Stockholm on May 10th. Normally, he would have reported to Foreign Minister Christian Gunther first, but mindful of his assignment from Shigemitsu, he opted instead to meet Minister Okamoto Suamasa right away for a confidential discussion. He hurried from the ferry to the Japanese legation, eager to talk about his intermediary role with the Allies. Having left Tokyo before the telegram was delivered, the sensitivity of the subject likely prevented the ministry from informing him en route to Stockholm. This implies that he was still unaware of the Foreign Ministry's decision made in mid-April, which ruled out any involvement by the Swedish Foreign Ministry in Japan's peace efforts. The two diplomats convened at the Japanese legation at 11 o'clock. Bagge anticipated engaging in meaningful discussions with Okamoto about the peace initiatives for Japan, which he had previously addressed with Shigemitsu and which he understood Togo, Shigemitsu's successor, supported. Bagge recounted in his affidavit to the IMTFE that he inquired of Okamoto whether he had received any confidential messages regarding peace negotiations and mentioned his serious discussions with Shigemitsu prior to leaving Japan. He stated that Shigemitsu had been quite direct, asking him to gauge interest in peace talks. Okamoto acknowledged that it was a significant issue but claimed he had not been informed about it. Bagge then requested Okamoto to check whether he should proceed with his peace efforts, to which Okamoto responded that he would send a telegram. Okamoto's later report to Foreign Minister Togo on the same day lacked specific details about Bagge's inquiries, instead referring to it vaguely as the matter brought up by Minister Sakaya. This ambiguity likely served as a precaution due to the highly confidential nature of the discussion. Okamoto emphasized that if the intention was for the Swedish government to lead peace negotiations independently, it was crucial to confirm this discreetly to Bagge. When Bagge met with Foreign Minister Christian Günther, the specifics of their conversation remain uncertain, as no notes were recorded. It's likely they discussed a few key issues: Sweden's position regarding Japan's request for mediation, the situation in Japan itself, and Japan's interest in involving Bagge. Concerning the first point, the decision had been made a month prior, and the Swedish government was not ready to take any initiative. For Günther, it was out of the question for Sweden to get involved in any complexities surrounding Japan. However, he recognized the importance of informing the United States government. On April 19th, United States Secretary of State Edward Stettinius sent a message to his minister in Stockholm, Herschel Johnson, regarding information provided by the Swedes earlier that month. The department preferred that the legation maintain a neutral stance and refrain from taking any initiative in this matter, as doing so might suggest there was a possibility of modifying the United States' demand for unconditional surrender. However, it was acceptable for the legation to express appreciation verbally for the courtesy extended by the Swedish government. This message indicated that while the United States was only interested in Japan's unconditional surrender, they were keen to be informed of any Japanese diplomatic overtures. Therefore, it became urgent to relay Bagge's information, and Günther promptly organized a lunch with Johnson and Bagge. This lunch took place on April 12th. 3 days later, Johnson reported back to Washington on the discussions at the lunch. Bagge spoke about the likelihood of the Soviet Union entering the war and mentioned that Japan would never agree to unconditional surrender, even preferring national suicide, especially if the Japanese imperial institution came under threat. Johnson responded by stating that the United States would never permit Japan to set conditions. This report sheds light on 3 key points. First, Bagge did not mention any interest from Japan in involving Sweden in peace negotiations, or the important role that certain Japanese figures attributed to him, which was perhaps not unexpected given that he was seated next to his superior, who had firmly dismissed any Swedish involvement. Second, Johnson's comment about the United States not allowing Japan to impose conditions can be interpreted as a subtle critique of Bagge's position, as the Swedish Foreign Ministry had informed the United States legation about Bagge's previous reports from Tokyo, making Johnson aware of his advocacy for Japan. Third, Günther is not mentioned in Johnson's report. Recognizing the Swedish Foreign Minister's reputation as a skilled diplomat, his approach, first uniting Bagge and Johnson, then having Bagge take the lead, was a clear signal that Sweden was not involved in Japan's peace discussions. Just 2 days later, Bagge discovered that Japan's military attaché in Stockholm, Onodera Makoto, had initiated a similar effort. The Swedish businessman Erik Erikson, previously blacklisted in London, was approached by Onodera to forge connections with United States and United Kingdom ministers in Stockholm. To facilitate these connections, Onodera encouraged Eriksson to reach out to Prince Carl Sr., the king's brother. In a discussion with the prince's chamberlain, Gustaf Crispin Lowenhielm, Eriksson inquired whether the prince could somehow mediate the contact. Onodera sought with the United States and United Kingdom ministers. On April 16th, Bagge met with Okamoto, who reported back to Foreign Minister Togo the very next day. Okamoto stated that Bagge had promptly referenced Onodera's initiative, asserting that the Swedish Foreign Ministry had swiftly dismissed it as an unhelpful interference. The ministry deemed the action inappropriate for a military attaché regarding such a significant issue, labeling it a clumsy move. Bagge cautioned that if Onodera persisted, it would disrupt the main initiative and pose serious risks. A confidential memo from the Swedish Foreign Ministry archives corroborates Okamoto's account, revealing that the prince had promptly alerted the ministry about Onodera's request, which the ministry had also rejected without delay. This reaction was anticipated, rooted in the government's mid-April decision on how to approach Japanese inquiries. By the following month, any proposal from a steadfast Nazi associate acting on behalf of a Japanese general carried even less weight. With Nazi Germany recently defeated by the Allied powers, their focus was solely on the unconditional surrender of Japan, the last remaining adversary. Onodera's proposal not only faced rejection from the foreign ministry, but this information was also relayed back to the Japanese side. A handwritten note in the confidential memo from the foreign ministry states that Bagge advised the Japanese minister to have General Onodera cease any further outreach. Consequently, since the Swedish side showed no interest in Onodera's overture, his efforts were cut short before they could gain any real momentum. After informing Okamoto of Onodera's dismissal, Bagge inquired if there had been any feedback from Tokyo regarding his own actions, but Okamoto indicated there was none. Bagge believed it was crucial to ascertain Togo's perspective, which meant they would need to exercise patience. When Okamoto asked if Bagge had spoken with the British and Americans in Stockholm, Bagge mentioned he had indeed met with the U.S. minister and presented an honest account of the situation in Japan, drawing on his decade of experience and friendship with the country. What Bagge communicated to Okamoto is notable for two reasons. First, despite knowing that his government had outright rejected any initiative regarding Japanese peace proposals, he didn't disclose this official stance to Okamoto. Instead, he inquired if anything had come from Tokyo. This could suggest that Bagge still held out hope of acting as a mediator between Japan and the United States and the United Kingdom, given the lack of communication channels between the two warring factions. His role seemed to remain crucial. Second, it's clear that Bagge overestimated his position during his meeting with Johnson. While he aimed to demonstrate his diplomatic capabilities to a key U.S. official, he missed the opportunity to make a lasting impression. Even if he was viewed as a potential mediator by the Japanese, he needed to be accepted by the other party as well. Offering Johnson an objective perspective was expected of a diplomat, but referring to himself as a friend of Japan, in a meeting with the primary U.S. diplomat in Stockholm, who represented Japan's principal adversary in the war, did not resonate with Johnson, as evidenced by his subtle criticism of Bagge. On the Japanese side, Foreign Minister Togo likely became more concerned upon reading Okamoto's telegram from May 17th. While Bagge was in Tokyo, Sakaya informed Togo that the Swedish government would take the lead independently. However, what Okamoto heard during his meeting with Bagge on May 10th contradicted this. If it was intended for the Swedish government to fully handle peace negotiations on its own, they needed to privately confirm that with Bagge. This required planning within Japan, primarily because the hardliners in the military were adamant against accepting any notion of defeat. Unconditional surrender, as demanded by the Allies, was not an option. Paul Ketskemetti noted in his analysis that if such a move had been made, the extremist factions within the army, who held strong beliefs in the concept of a holy war for Japan, would have staged a coup. In such a scenario, not even government officials would be secure. Kase Toshikazu pointed out in his book that contacts with foreign diplomats during that period were risky and could raise suspicions from the vigilant military police. The events of April, when numerous individuals were arrested for perceived anti-war sentiments, served as a stark warning to anyone seeking a peace arrangement. Throughout this time, a key consideration for Japan was that any Swedish involvement should appear as Sweden acting independently to avoid any impression of weakness. Togo needed to tread carefully. What Baggy conveyed to Okamoto about his meeting with Johnson might not encompass everything that occurred. If it was revealed that attempts to communicate with the enemy had support from influential Japanese, even from within the government, the military hardliners would undermine any chance for peace. Therefore, Togo's response to Okamoto on May 18th was deliberately vague. What happened during the previous government needs to be investigated carefully, and this will take time. Togo's reaction indicated that the initiative led by Bag had also been set aside by the Japanese side. As the war began to unravel for Japan, various peace proposals were suggested. At the end of 1945, Dean Acheson, who was the acting Secretary of State for the U.S., stated, "There is no evidence of any peace offer or any statement looking toward peace transmitted to this government before 10 August 1945 from official Japanese sources or from any person authorized to act as an agent for the Japanese government." However, this assertion is somewhat inaccurate because the Baggy peace feeler had the support of Foreign Minister Shigemitsu and his successor Togo, at least at first. In typical discussions on Japanese foreign policy, Togo is often seen as the one who abandoned the effort to use Baggy to facilitate communication with the United States and the United Kingdom. A recent assessment indicates that while Shigemitsu showed some interest, Togo, who took over afterward, was doubtful and pulled the plug on the overtures. But as we've seen, this doesn't align with what actually transpired. Initially, Togo was open to Baggy as an intermediary, a sentiment the Swede learned just before leaving Japan. Eventually, Togo's perspective shifted, as highlighted in his telegram to Okamoto on May 17th. The exact reasons remain unclear. Baggy's immediate thought was that this change stemmed from Togo's strong position in Moscow, since he previously served as the Japanese ambassador there. Shigemitsu noted in his memoirs that Togo halted any further actions by stating that the cabinet had changed meanwhile, suggesting he preferred to maintain existing relations with Russia. In his earlier account, Kase mentioned that throughout the Pacific War, Japan focused its diplomatic efforts largely on Moscow, which may partly explain why the Soviet government was chosen as the channel to communicate with the Allied powers before Japan's surrender. Shigemitsu's assertion that Baggy agreed to mediate upon returning to Stockholm aligns with Togo's perception. Togo believed Sweden was ready to explore discussions with the United States and the United Kingdom, but this doesn't align with what Baggy reported to the Swedish Foreign Ministry. In his telegram dated 19 September 1944, he detailed what essentially was a peace feeler aimed not at the Allied powers as a whole, but specifically targeting the UK for a Japanese-initiated agreement. In a telegram dated April 11, 1945, he relayed that Shigemitsu had requested his help in formulating an acceptable solution and to cooperate with Okamoto for this purpose in the interest of peace. The Swedish Foreign Ministry maintained that Sweden would not initiate any proposals or provide information. However, the ministry had asked Bagge to keep in contact with his source, reflecting an active interest in his involvement. In 1960, British historian Richard Story reached out to Bagge for his insights on the final phases of the war. Bagge's reflections shed light on his perspective. Story mentioned Onodera's actions, which he believed had complicated matters for Bagge. This observation was understandable, as although Bagge's and Onodera's peace efforts were separate, they were sometimes conflated. Bagge acknowledged that Story's perception had some merit. While General Onodera's efforts were not particularly successful, I don't believe they caused any significant harm. He recounted how Shigemitsu had been candid and straightforward during their meeting, and there was no hint of ambiguity, as suggested by Mr. Kass in his writings. They agreed on general approaches, and it was clear that the Japanese side would need to make concessions, although Shigemitsu did not specify what those would be. As he recalled in his memoirs, "I only insisted that the terms must align with Japan's honor." Baga's most crucial point addressed the mission he was asked to undertake. In the collection of documents published by Gaimusho, there are two misleading passages that require clarification. The statements from Mr. Tadashi Sakaya and Mr. Shigemitsu imply that I offered to mediate for peace negotiations. This is incorrect, and I have maintained a cautious stance throughout, while being ready to help for the greater good when requested. Baga maintained that he kept his demeanor carefully reserved and insisted he had not positioned himself as a mediator. However, he also claimed he was ready to step in for the greater good when asked. What he specifically refuted was the idea that he had volunteered for a mediatory role. He was willing to take on responsibility if it was requested. Yet, when the chance came to enhance his supposed position as a go-between, it was clear that he misunderstood what was required from such a role. The question arises, why did he jeopardize any chance of success by being overly assertive when he met Johnson? Perhaps it can be explained by a remark from a Swedish foreign policy insider regarding three diplomats named Baggy at the Swedish Foreign Ministry during the same period. They were referred to as Big Baggy, Medium Bag, and Little Bag, based on their skills, and regrettably, Widar was referred to as Little Bag. What transpired during Bag's meeting with Johnson seems to support this insider's assessment of Sweden's former envoy to Japan. He was acutely aware of his shortcomings and acknowledged them to a Japanese journalist in Stockholm as the war drew to a close. Yet, he fondly recalled the brief window in May 1945 when Japan's national fate was decided, taking pride in his involvement in the great power dynamics that influence nations. Nonetheless, when he was offered the envoy position in Cairo after Tokyo, he wasn't particularly excited about it. As the war in Europe neared its conclusion, Finland sought peace with Moscow, Denmark and Norway were liberated, and on May 2, 1945, just 2 days after Hitler's suicide, Soviet troops captured Berlin. While not all occupied nations regained freedom immediately, such as the Baltic states, which would remain under foreign control for another 50 years, Stockholm erupted in celebratory peace festivities on May 7th, witnessed by surprised Japanese diplomats. Unlike Finland and Denmark, which cut diplomatic ties, or Norway, which even declared war, relations between Stockholm and Tokyo remained stable. On July 31, 1945, Sweden's national coalition government ceased to exist, replaced by a social democratic cabinet, with Östenunden stepping in as foreign minister. With the European war behind them, Sweden was poised for a path to post-war prosperity, a stark contrast to Japan's situation. On August 15th, the emperor's voice was broadcasted for the first time, announcing the nation's unconditional surrender and ordering all forces to lay down their arms. Just 2 weeks later, on September 2nd, Foreign Minister Shigemitsu Mamoru signed the surrender documents aboard the USS Missouri. The long Second World War, which had started at a railway in Manchuria, concluded on that battleship in the Pacific. Japan accepted its defeat. This marked the beginning of a 7-year U.S. occupation, a transitional government in Tokyo, war crime trials, and the reorganization of the former empire. Korea regained its independence but quickly divided into two nations, both of which would endure a devastating conflict, the initial clash of the emerging Cold War. Manchukuo was absorbed back into China, while Taiwan was liberated and eventually became the refuge for Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China after he lost the mainland to the Communists, who declared the People's Republic of China from the former capital of Peking in 1949. Many in the empire's diaspora, soldiers and civilians alike, finally returned home after years in captivity. They arrived in a devastated Japan, where major cities lay in ruins. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were the most notorious examples, having been leveled by the atomic bombs. Other cities faced similar devastation from conventional warfare, such as the firebombing raid on Tokyo during the night of March 9th to 10th, which resulted in over 100,000 deaths, comparable to the toll of the atomic attacks. Minister Bage did not witness the destruction, but his Swiss counterpart, Camille Gorget, described Tokyo in September 1945 as a moon-like city, disfigured, ruins stretching for kilometers. I do not know where I am. I cannot recognize any neighborhood. I am somewhere else on another planet. The Gaimusho was in ruins, and its diplomatic influence was shattered. With its sovereignty lost, all authority over Japan's foreign relations shifted to the U.S. occupying forces under General Douglas MacArthur and the U.S. government. The Americans quickly prohibited independent Japanese diplomacy, ordering that embassies and consulates be transferred to U.S. representatives. This signaled the end of any official diplomatic communication between Japan and other nations. Foreign representatives were only permitted to engage with the beleaguered Gaimusho for administrative matters, not for political interactions with the provisional Japanese cabinet. Until mid-November 1945, when Japan severed diplomatic ties with Sweden, Erich von Sydow held the position of charge d'affaires. Subsequently, Olaf Ripa took over as the diplomatic representative to the supreme commander of the Allied powers. Sweden was unable to appoint a new plenipotentiary in Tokyo or welcome any new Japanese officials in Stockholm. It's ironic that Swedish-Japanese diplomacy withstood 15 years of conflict, but faltered with the return of peace. To be precise, Shigemitsu's signature on the Missouri didn't truly restore peace. It merely ended the fighting. A formal peace treaty wasn't signed until 1951 in San Francisco. It was only then that Japan reclaimed its sovereignty, allowing for the swift reestablishment of diplomatic ties with Sweden. Meanwhile, Sweden's other key interest, trade, began to rebound from the wartime disruptions. Remarkably, commerce resumed quite quickly. While official trade statistics for Sweden were absent in 1946, they make a return in 1947. The figures reveal that exports reached a modest value of about 500,000 CK, while imports surged to over 9 million SEK, nearly matching the levels before Pearl Harbor. The subsequent years of U.S. occupation continued to foster growth in both exports and imports. By the time Japan regained its independence, trade volumes had escalated significantly compared to what they were before the Pacific War. Therefore, even though the occupation curtailed official diplomatic engagement between Sweden and Japan, it did not end their trade relationship. In fact, the cessation of hostilities paved the way for a return to normal business practices. The aim of this book was to explore Sweden's interactions with Japan during this tumultuous period, shedding light on the broader international context of the long Second World War. So, what insights have we gained? We can now understand why Swedish-Japanese relations remained stable during the conflicts in China and the Pacific. The simple yet truthful answer is that it always made sense for Sweden and Japan to maintain normal relations. The Swedish experience was, as social scientists often describe, path-dependent. Just as Sweden maintained its ties with the United States and Great Britain, there was no reason for Stockholm to sever its relationship with Japan. After 1905, Japan became a crucial player in Sweden's trade strategy in the Far East. While trade with Japan and China was not as extensive as with the major Western powers or Scandinavian nations, Swedish businesses sought to keep connections to this region, which they identified as a promising market. Although Japan's actions within the League of Nations conflicted with Sweden's goals for a law-based international community, Japan's provocations were never specifically aimed at Sweden. There was no Swedish equivalent to a Pearl Harbor or even a Manila incident. Unlike Spain, Japan was not responsible for significant Swedish casualties or violations of essential interests. While Stockholm was dissatisfied with Tokyo's behavior, relations were never strained to the extent that a complete break was warranted. Additionally, as the war shifted against Japan, Sweden was so actively involved in diplomatic efforts for both Tokyo and the Allies that cutting ties would have harmed both sides. From a humanitarian angle, Sweden served as a neutral party capable of facilitating diplomacy between the conflicting sides, acting in the interests of all involved. However, it's important to recognize that these efforts were not solely altruistic. As Envoy Bagge articulated, Sweden's good office services were part of a strategic engagement aimed at promoting its own trade interests. This approach didn't always yield immediate results, particularly in the later years of the Pacific War. But given how swiftly trade resumed after the fighting ended, one might conclude it had its merits. Previous discussions also highlight that Sweden's reversion to traditional neutrality in the late 1930s was influenced not just by the Abyssinian sanctions debacle and the threat from a rearming Germany, but also by Japan's aggressive actions in East Asia. Sweden was a prominent voice in Geneva against these aggressions, but without united efforts through sanctions or intervention, there was little that could be done to rein in Japan's militarism. Even after Tokyo withdrew from the League of Nations, there were no repercussions. Sweden's actions don't suggest a higher moral stance. Stockholm also refrained from enforcing punishment on its own. While unilateral action could have been pursued, even a grassroots consumer boycott after the bombing of Chinese cities struggled to gain traction. Influential figures from both the business sector and diplomatic circles supported Japan's narrative regarding the Manchurian question, claiming Japan was merely maintaining order in a chaotic area. There was simply no unified understanding of Manchuria or the Chinese incident, both domestically and internationally, which hindered collective security efforts through the League. Only when this failure became starkly clear, worsened by the Abyssinian crisis, did Stockholm revert to a stance of neutrality, as it was the only remaining security approach without multilateral discussions. Once that choice was made, it was evident that there would be no further political or commercial opposition to Japan. Furthermore, during World War I, Sweden's foreign trade policy was unwaveringly neutral, a stance the government believed was essential for balanced neutrality. However, this insistence on fairness towards both warring parties, instead of prioritizing the needs of the Swedish people, led to severe food shortages and significant social unrest. By 1939, it became apparent that neutrality needed to be more adaptable, focusing less on equal trade and more on national interests. Like other nations, neutrals had the right to prioritize their own needs. Notably, it was the passionate internationalist Östen Undén who articulated this shift in policy in 1938. As the European conflict progressed, Sweden then engaged in asymmetric trade with both the Allied and Axis powers. The economic advantages offered to each side depended largely on the war's evolution and the perceived threats. Given this strategy and Sweden's previous clear separation of commerce and politics in relations with Japan, it's unsurprising that the business-as-usual approach persisted right up until 1945 and beyond. To achieve this, Sweden had to fully commit by having Envoy Bagge take control of the empire's trade interests. Even the directors of trading companies found themselves frustrated by his involvement in price setting and negotiating terms with customers. This was a typical response to the nationalization of Japanese industry under government control. As Japan's private enterprises were absorbed into the state, Swedish trade had to adapt to keep pace in negotiations. However, it's crucial to remember that the blend of diplomacy and commerce worked both ways. The Pacific War not only escalated the diplomatic tasks and expenses for Bagge and the legation, due to the mandates of protecting power and new humanitarian duties, but it was also the presence of Swedish personnel and resources in Japan and globally that enabled Bagge and the Swedish government to navigate these challenges. The capability to employ Swedish staff and utilize their funds was vital for the legation's operations. The days when foreign nationals could act as agents of Swedish diplomacy, as honorary consuls, were gone. From 1941 to 1945, only a Swedish passport could open doors to internment camps or persuade the Kempeitai to allow its holders to carry out their protecting power responsibilities. In essence, the partnership between private and public sectors within the Swedish network overseas was vital for both neutral trade and diplomacy. It's also noteworthy that Sweden remained diplomatically active throughout those 15 years. Initially, Stockholm played a significant role in Geneva, where it adopted a multilateral foreign relations strategy through the League of Nations. Later, it focused more on bilateral engagements with Japan and other combatants, as warfare heightened its value as a diplomatic partner. This continued even when Japan had diminished political significance for Sweden, and Swedish leaders and the public were preoccupied with the European situation. Neutrality didn't equate to inactivity. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs remained engaged, allocating additional resources to manage the increasing demands of its proactive diplomacy. It's important to note that semantics played a surprisingly significant role. The fact that both the Mukden and Marco Polo Bridge events were labeled as incidents, much like Nomonhan, and that Japan's aggressive actions in China were presented in a similarly understated way, affected how Sweden managed these situations. This becomes evident when we contrast it with the official war Japan declared against the United States and the Allies. Tokyo even sent an official declaration of war through its embassy in Washington, but only after the attack on Pearl Harbor. While none of these events ended Swedish-Japanese relations, they influenced the bilateral relationship quite differently. Clearly, this story is one of change. The waves of violence from Japanese militarists in 1931, 1937, and 1941 led to noticeable shifts in Sweden's interactions with Japan. Yet it also remained a continuous experience. From Sweden's viewpoint, the long Second World War resembled the Cold War, a conflict that surrounded them, posing threats but never escalating into actual warfare for Stockholm. Although the long Second World War had a profound effect on the international landscape, which influenced how a neutral nation could relate to its partners, the wars of others did not create an all-or-nothing scenario for Sweden. Indeed, the warfare of the 1940s could have easily reached its shores. It was a moment filled with uncertainty. However, the fact that it didn't allow Sweden to navigate its international engagements in a way that differed from the belligerents, while aligning with its interests and historical context. In this light, the narrative highlights how neutrality for Sweden served not only as a domestic security strategy, but also as an effective tool of its foreign policy, even extending to Japan.